What a great hymn to sing, as always, a hymn by Isaac Watts, and some good theology there as we come to considering tonight the church at Wapping. And it is an interesting church. I pray you'll find it as interesting as I do. I love this history, and we really can't speak about this church without speaking about how this church got to be. So, in speaking about Hercules Collins, the man we're wanting to get to, we want to lay the groundwork and not overlook some other important men who were instrumental in the events that took place, or even having the church at Wapping, that Hercules Collins could pastor and then sign the confession while pastoring that church. So I want to begin, first of all, with John Spilsbury, and he's an interesting figure, an important figure. Murray Tolmie, who wrote an important book on Baptists and Congregationalists, said that Spilsbury is perhaps the first true discernible Baptist. Like, there's a lot of people before that we talk about who have elements of Baptist doctrine, but the first person you can probably point to that you could say has a fully developed Baptist doctrine that could be identified as Baptist without any Anabaptist strains to it or any of that sort of thing, you would say is probably John Spilsbury. Ernest Kevin, in a book he wrote, said that he is often called rightly the founder of the Baptists. If you want to say, well, where do we come from? You can point to a lot of precursors to Baptists, but probably the first person that you could identify fully without any issues as a Baptist is John Spilsbury. John Spilsbury was born in 1593 in London. He was, we don't know a lot about his early years, as is the case with most people from this era, because there wasn't much written about them, not a lot of records kept. But he seems to have been an enterprising man, a noted cobbler, who was a cobbler in the district of Aldersgate, which, if you know anything about London, and historically there were 7 gates, and they all have different names. We talk often about St. Helens, the church that we get our Sunday school material from. That's St. Helens of Bishopgate. That was one of the 7 gates. And just a little bit to the west of that was another gate in the old days of the old town of London called the Aldersgate. And that gate is significant for a number of reasons. One of the main reasons it's significant in history, especially for Christians, is it's the location of some preaching. Mennonite preaching happened there a lot, and a lot of Germanic preaching happened there. But John Wesley went there to hear some preaching one time. Actually, was hearing an introduction to the book of Romans, and in hearing this, just the introduction to the book of Romans, read aloud, publicly read aloud, he said he felt his heart strangely warmed, and began to recognize that the doctrine he was hearing proclaimed, which was Luther's doctrine, it's Luther's book, An Introduction to the book of Romans, that he realized it was the first time he'd actually heard the gospel, and he was saved at the Aldersgate. And so this was an important thing for Wesley. And if you remember our journey through Wesley as one of our studies in our Reformation church history, then you'll remember that he had a really interesting life after that, even before that, really. But after that, certainly one of the most influential lives in the history of the church. So Aldersgate was an important place historically, and it is where he was a cobbler. He was a repairer of shoes. And that's what he did for a living. Back in those days, it wasn't like we do today. You know, you wear your tread out, you throw your shoes out, and you go get a new pair of shoes. In those days, you went and got your shoes repaired, resoled, repaired, whatever you needed. And that's what he did. And he had a shop at Aldersgate and seems to have been very successful. He is referred to by one of his enemies as a weigher of hay. And that's an interesting charge. A hay weigher, let me try to get that right, a hay weigher in Elizabethan commerce was someone who literally would measure out hay and sell it for livestock or cattle that were at the gate. If you rode your horse into town and your horse needed some hay to graze on, then you could go and buy it from him. So apparently, as a part of what he did as a cobbler, he had a side living also, a side hustle going on of selling hay to livestock that would come in through the Aldersgate. Now, how much he was directly involved in that, I don't know. Maybe he had somebody that was handling it for him. But whatever the case, he seems to have had a couple of businesses and was kind of a kind of hustling kind of guy, trying to get stuff done, make some money, and get it all done. So he was industrious and was well regarded in the area. Now, we don't know a lot about him, like I said, from his early days. But we do know that very early in around 1630, he's attending the JLJ church. So we talked about this one church that all the Baptists end up tracing their roots back to, an independent church, kind of like a Union church. If any of you are familiar with the Union church, a little bit earlier age than we're in now, my first time preaching outside this church was preaching in a Union church. And a Union church is a church that basically was a gathering of people of different denominations. In the early days, in communities where they couldn't afford to build separate churches, they would build one church building. And the Methodists would get it week 1, the Baptists week 2, the Presbyterians week 3. And over time, generally, they would kind of finally agree on a pastor they could all get along with. And they would just come every week, you know. And that's how it kind of got to be this designation. Well, that's kind of what the JLJ church was like. You had Congregationalists, you had some Presbyterians, some Baptists. And it just, you kind of all came together under this tent. And generally speaking, people got along. But it does seem like sometimes people would become convicted of their beliefs. And this happened, we talked about before with this church, a number of times where people like Knowles and others would begin to say, I think baptism is a big deal. And maybe we're underestimating it, maybe we're underappreciating it. And so we need to reconsider this and think about the importance of baptism. Well, before Knowles ever came along and did that, Spilsbury did. In 1633, Spilsbury, so I would say about 1630, we don't know exactly the dates, he begins to get really involved in thinking about baptism, somewhere in the early 1630s. And over the course of a couple of years, while at the JLJ church, he begins to think it's maybe a bigger deal and maybe infant baptism is wrong. And so he goes and talks to the pastors of the church at that time, you know, just asking, you know, what should we think about this? And much like, if you remember, I said with Knowles, it began kind of, first of all, can you answer questions for me? And he didn't feel like he was getting sufficient answers back. And then it began to be kind of debates within the church. And he didn't feel like the other side was, this is talking about Knowles, did not feel like the other side was giving adequate answers. And eventually they just cordially agreed to split. It wasn't a nasty thing like often you see in splits. It was just like, hey, we think that this is a big deal and you're not emphasizing it and we don't want to press our things on you, so we're just going to separate and have our own church. Well, in 1633, this had already happened because Spilsbury came along and said to Henry Jesse, I think this is a bigger deal than you're making it. And I think that it's incompatible. Infant baptism, he said, I think is incompatible with the new covenant. Now, he came to this conclusion, and we talked about this a little bit last week with other men, but he came to this conclusion by hearing the arguments for why you should baptize your infants. And it always went back to the Abrahamic covenant. And he kept asking, but wait a minute, are you understanding that correctly? And so this is kind of how it began. I won't go through it again. We talked about it last week. But this is the argument from the very beginning of the Baptist is the Paedo-Baptist understanding of the Abrahamic covenant correct? Or have they missed an important distinction about that covenant? One of the other earliest Baptists, Thomas Patient, wrote a book called Baptism and the Distinction of the Covenants, and that's what the entire book's about. That's what these men were really focused on, and making sure we're getting those covenants right. So anyway, to continue on, he goes out and says, okay, we're going to start meeting somewhere else. A few families go with him. It's not a lot of people, but there's enough people. He begins to preach. It seems like from the very beginning, 1633, they find a location that they can meet in on what's called Old Gravel Lane in the district of Wapping in London. And so that's going to be obviously important because it becomes the Wapping Baptist Church because it's in the Wapping district. But they meet at Old Gravel Lane, and over time they're meeting in different locations there. As they can find space and as they grow, they need a new space, and they just keep finding locations over time where they can meet. And during this time, he pastors this church and becomes really noted. I mentioned earlier, the first person that you can really discern as a Baptist all around, he really builds their reputation during this phase because he's making arguments that nobody else is making. You know, this is in 1635, 1636, 1637. There is no other Baptist church. So any arguments that you're going to direct against Baptists are coming to Spilsbury. And I mean, there's some other men, but they don't have churches at that time. And so it's really Spilsbury who becomes kind of the face of Baptists in that day. And so he had never received formal theological education, but he was a brilliant theologian. If you read his writings, it really is surprising to think that this man was not better trained. But he was a man in the Word. I think oftentimes about men like Spurgeon and Bunyan. What is a theological education supposed to do anyway? It's supposed to make you aware of the Scriptures and how to study the Word and all the theological background, and all that is great. But some people just devour book upon book. They study to where they end up with a better education than those sometimes that went to school. And you see that, I think, here certainly with Spilsbury, who becomes a brilliant theologian, an expositor of the Word, and an able writer and debater of these issues, and was quite successful. And that's why his church was growing during this time, because people were like, I think these Baptists may have an answer here. They may have something. Well, he became more influential in 1638 by just continuing what he's already doing, because that group of men that we talked about around that time broke away in 1638. Men like, this is not when Knowles broke away, but this was right before that. This was men like William Kiffin and Thomas Patient. They had been going to the JLJ church, and they broke away. They became convinced that baptism was, in fact, a big deal. There's some debate on how they were getting into these arguments. Were they coming sometimes to Spilsbury's church? We don't know. There's not enough written about it. But we do know that they become convinced, and they leave, and they go to his church. So at this time, you can say, by the late 1630s, you can say three of the most prominent early Baptists are at this one church, right? Thomas Patient, William Kiffin, and John Spilsbury. And it's not only that they're great teachers and arguers and bold men, but Kiffin was a man, and we're not going to get to cover him this term. We will in a future term, because he eventually leaves here in a little bit of a disagreement. Again, not mean-spirited, but they just have a disagreement on if you're not baptized, whether you can join the church, that sort of thing. And so he leaves and starts a new church, and Patient, who is a very good friend of Kiffin's, goes with him. But Kiffin was a very important figure for the Wapping church in those early days because he was an extremely wealthy man. I mentioned several weeks ago an unusual event that happened when King Charles II came back to the throne. He'd been exiled when his father was arrested and executed, and they invited him back because after Cromwell had died, his son Richard Cromwell tried to take over, and it was an administrative disaster for the state. And then they couldn't find anybody that could really keep the protectorate going. And so finally, Parliament was like, we need a king again. Let's invite Charles back, Charles II, and have him as king again. And Charles came back to a country that was broke. He had kind of a lavish lifestyle that he wanted. And so he's looking for money. And so he would persecute people if he thought he could take their lands and their wealth. But he went to William Kiffin. Now think about this. The king goes to William Kiffin and says, will you give me a loan? Now this tells you how important William Kiffin was. He asked him for 40,000 pounds. Now I mentioned this to you before. I don't know if I told this complete story. I'm going to right now, just so you can get the feel of this. He asked for 40,000 pounds, which can you imagine in like 1660 what 40,000 pounds would be today? It's a lot of money. And William Kiffin, who was no fool, says, Your Highness, I don't believe I can afford to loan 40,000 pounds, but here's what I would like to do instead. I would like to give you a gift of 10,000 pounds, And so he just gave him 10,000 pounds. And one of his friends famously asked him, why on earth would you give 10,000 pounds to the king? You don't even like him, He was like, by my reckoning, that saved my pocket 30,000 pounds, because he knew he wasn't going to get any of it back no matter what, right? So anyway, so this was a wealthy man. So obviously having him in your church was a benefit for an upstart church trying to find places to meet. He had resources and so forth. So he's an important part of the story as well. But what we want to see here is Spilsbury, in leading this church, just continued to be very influential, not only because of his writings, and he wrote a number of writings, but also because he started the first Reformed Baptist church, the first identifiable Baptist church. There it was. He's the pastor of it. So he has kind of a seniority. Knowles would kind of have that same level of seniority. Kiffin would, but there's just a handful of men in those earliest days that their name carried a weight because, and by the way, part of that's because they stepped out when it was dangerous to do so, right? It wasn't an easy thing to do. And so people knew they believed what they said they believed because they put their name on the line, and many of them spent many years in prison. We'll hear some more about that with Hercules Collins, who we're going to come to in just a moment. But again, this church continued to be very influential even after Kiffin leaves it, because it is that first Reformed Baptist church. It became, over time, a training church for pastors, which we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute with Hercules Collins as well. But Spilsbury made it one of his goals to train up other leaders. And one of the things that they fell into when he died was that they didn't have someone to immediately take his place, because they were training up all these men and sending them out, and they had forgotten to make sure they had people. And so it created them having to bring in the second pastor of the church, a man named Northcott, and he was actually formerly an Anglican minister who'd been thrown out in the Great Ejection, which maybe you've heard about in the Puritan age, the Great Ejection, where all the questionable ministers that the Church of England wasn't happy with were expelled. He was one of those, and then had become a Baptist over the years by conviction. But anyway, this church is a very important church, and like I said, it began in 1633. Spilsbury did some important works. I mentioned already in 1643 when he kind of really made a name for himself beyond just having this church, was he wrote something called A Treatise Concerning the Lawful Subjects of Baptism. And it's basically a covenant theological argument for who should be baptized and why shouldn't it be babies? Why should it be those who believe? And this is an argument that is still going on, isn't it? I was watching, just saw a YouTube short a couple of days ago where a guy that I follow for some trail running stuff, he was talking about, he was saying, hey, we baptized a baby at our church on Sunday. And his friend was like, well, of course. He's like, you go to a Presbyterian church. And he said, yeah. And I guess this is linking to a larger interview. But he said, yeah, but show me that in the Bible. Like, show me that in the Bible. Show me where it's expressly commanded to baptize our babies. And so, again, that's the same debate they were entering into in 1633, 1634, and on and on and on. And people are still arguing about it today. All right, another major work that he wrote is the First London Baptist Confession of Faith. John Spilsbury is the primary author of that document. How do we know that? Because nobody really signed it to say, I'm the primary author. But all the enemies of that document in those days, all the people who were slandering the document, would say, and its primary author, John Spilsbury. So they were telling us who they knew had been the primary author of that. And probably the reason that he was in 1643, I already mentioned that he wrote a treatise concerning lawful subjects of baptism. In that same year, he also wrote a statement of faith for his church, for the Wapping Church, which was a 10-pointed statement of faith. And other churches apparently were interested in that. And that might have been then the genesis of expanding that into what became the First London Baptist Confession of Faith. In 1646, he wrote God's Ordinance, the Saints' Privilege, which, again, about baptism, and that was later added on to, expanded by Benjamin Cox. He came along at his request, at Spilsbury's request, to add to that. That's the respect he had for Benjamin Cox, who we looked at last week. And then finally, in 1650, he wrote, as a co-author, a work called Heart Bleedings for Professors' Abominations. And this was about the Quakers in those earliest days and some of the things that they were doing that he felt were dangerous. And so that's kind of the works that he gave us, the leading works. But he comes down not only to us as an important early Baptist and maybe as you could argue, the father of Baptists, but certainly the founder of the first church, and the church that we're going to be looking at tonight, the Wapping Baptist Church. Well, that brings us, if we pass Northcott, which I hate to do. Again, he's an interesting figure in and of himself, but we really want to get to our main guy, Hercules Collins, tonight, because he is the man that signed the document that we're talking about, the London Baptist Confession, the Second London Baptist Confession. He was born in 1647, so he's a little bit later, obviously. We know that only because of his tombstone which you can still read his dates on there. And so that's how we know when he was born. The first 11 years of his life saw turmoil that's almost unprecedented in history. Because if you take when he was born and just start the clock on, I mean, that entire century, right, is often known as the rebellious century or the century of rebellion. It was kind of a crazy century, but that 11 years might have been like the craziest part, because he was born literally at the end of the English Civil War. So it was still going on, or was just kind of cooling off as he was born. And then he lived for, when he was 2 years old, the king was executed, right? Something that was pretty much unparalleled in the history of the world. Some people literally thought, if you take that axe through that man's neck, the world's going to end, right? Because, no one ever thought anything like this could happen before. So that happens when he's 2 years old. And then you have a republic era in England for a short time. And then you have a protectorate under Cromwell for a time. And then the couple of years after Cromwell dies, his son Richard comes in, and it's chaos for a couple of years. And then a return of the king when he's like 11 years old. This is kind of a crazy childhood to live in. I don't know just a child living in that age, how much they're aware of all that's going on. But I would think those events were so significant to daily life in England that you'd hear things about the king was killed and all these sorts of things going on. So it's just a crazy period to live in. And this was his childhood, his formative years. That same period of time saw great religious debate, right? The Westminster Assembly, the Savoy Declaration, all these things are being debated. The Presbyterians, the Congregationalists, the Anglicans arguing why they are right. And then the emergence of the Baptists. All this are happening during this time. One church historian said it was one of the very great theological periods in church history, and compared it to like the early church, the patriarchal period, and so on and so forth, that this is one of the most significant periods in the history of the theological development of the church. And again, he is born right into this period. And we don't know much about his parents. We don't know much about his childhood. We don't know much about his education, other than to say that he was not university educated, because he was a dissenter, and therefore he wouldn't have been allowed in during that era, wouldn't have been allowed into university. We don't even know why, because his parents apparently were very religious. So Michael Haykin, the great Baptist historian, said, I wonder why they would name him after a pagan mythological character. Why would they name their son Hercules? And the answer is people name their kids for all sorts of reasons, right? We don't know. But again, there's a lot we don't know about him. There's probably more we don't know than we do know. In fact, I think we can definitely say that there's more that we don't know. But again, we know that he was religious from a very early age. And by this, we mean he was a man of faith is what would be meant by that, not outwardly religious, but he was a man of faith. This wording comes to us from his actual funeral sermon that was preached by his friend and another excellent early Baptist minister, John Piggott. And we still have that funeral sermon. It was so many people respected Hercules Collins that people wanted print copies of that funeral address, and so it survived. And there are a few like that, very significant funeral addresses that survived. And sometimes we only have one sermon by someone, and it's because it was a funeral address of an important figure, and people wanted to keep that, and so it survived. And there's no other record of any other sermons that people gave. Now, that's not always the case, but it's often the case. And so it's just kind of interesting. So John Piggott had known him for years, said that he had a steadfast faith that he said had endured a great trial. Like, not meaning one trial, but trial upon trial upon trial. This was a man who had been tested, and tested often. He had married at 22 a woman named Sarah Pearson, and she died after 33 years of marriage. He had a lot of health issues that he had to go through alongside her. They had a difficult life together, not their marriage. Their marriage, from what we can tell, was a great marriage, but they went through a lot of strife. They lost their only son at 11 years old. On top of that, Hercules spends a lot of time in prison. I mean, he over and over again, and as we'll see in a minute, it's not just prison. We often think about prison because we think about like John Bunyan in Bedford, getting arrested, and it's almost like the it's almost like we get the idea that it's like they come in and go, okay, you gathered again, it's time to go back to jail. And it was like that. In certain places, it was like that. I think they even said at times Bunyan might have been able to even leave under certain jailers. They've been like, just come back, kind of like Otis, in the Andrew show, you know where the key is. And but it wasn't always like that. And it depended on where you were at and how sympathetic the jailer was to you. And we'll come back and see that it was not this way for Hercules Collins in Wapping. It was a very rough time and place to be. And so he endured a great deal and always endured it with faith and positivity. And so they suffered often for their Baptist beliefs, which were very unpopular. And so we mentioned that he wasn't university educated. He didn't go to Oxford, didn't go to Cambridge. But like many in that age, he was well versed in the scriptures. We just mentioned that with Spilsbury and many others. He's another one. People were often amazed at his grasp of scripture, his argumentation, his debating, his biblical theological knowledge, all these sorts of things. He was a man rooted in scripture. He shows up at the Wapping Church in 1677 at age 30. He's installed there as an elder at that time. So he was not at the church prior to becoming an elder. They sent for him. And again, it's possible that they sent him out to another church and just asked, can we have him back? It's possible because, again, they had trained so many men. But what we do know is from the church record books at the Petty France Church, he had been there at that time. So we don't know if he had just been attending there or if they had brought him over to give him some opportunities to learn, to preach and so forth. We don't know. But he had been at that church, and so he comes back to the Wapping Church to become their third pastor. We mentioned already the two previous pastors, but the church is still at Old Gravel Lane at this time. So it had been meeting there for like 40 years. And that isn't common in this era because there's so much persecution. Some gatherings were kind of moving around as often as they could to keep from the authorities knowing where they were. And so he comes to Old Gravel Lane and continues to preach there. And by the way, an interesting note, since you may remember I just said he was made the pastor at Wapping at 1677, and you may remember that this confession of faith is actually the confession of 1677, right? Ratified in 1689, and so he would have been at Petty France regardless of how he got there, how long he'd been there. If he'd been there at any length of time, which apparently he was, because he was a member, they refer to him as Brother Hercules Collins. Then he would have been there while the second confession was being worked out by the men there, William Collins and Nehemiah Cox. And some people have even now come back to wonder, could it be that Hercules Collins was involved more than we thought in the construction of the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith? I think there's a real possibility of that. One thing that's been noted for years before we knew this, people would say, it's amazing how often the wording in the Orthodox Catechism, which is the Baptist Catechism that Hercules Collins wrote, how often it's basically a Baptist adaptation of the Heidelberg Catechism. He said people would say it's amazing how often he's able to weave in the words of the Baptist Confession, to kind of update the language. And people just thought, well, he was familiar with the confession, but it may be that some of that language was his language. We just don't know. We don't know the extent of his involvement, but it would be hard to imagine that he wasn't right around it during that period and probably even involved. But whatever the case, in 1680, he publishes the Orthodox Catechism. There wasn't anything like that. We had really no catechism at that time. Maybe individual churches had some catechisms, but they had not originally done a catechism to go along with the confession. It was just too dangerous to meet, and they never got around to it. The Westminster Assembly, of course, they were meeting under the authorization of the government, so they were able to do their confession. They were able to do a longer catechism, a shorter catechism, a book of order. They did a lot of work during that time. The Baptists were meeting hoping not to get caught and go to jail, so they had to get their confession done. They didn't get around to a catechism until a couple of decades later, and we have our catechism, which, by the way, the catechism we do on Sundays, that Spurgeon's catechism, the Puritan catechism, is really just an update of what's often called Keach's catechism, although it probably wasn't Keach that was the primary author of that catechism. but it's very similar. And we're eventually going to go back, I think, when we finish this rotation and do Keach's catechism. But anyway, so Hercules Collins loved the Heidelberg Catechism. And if you've read the Heidelberg Catechism, you know why. It's beautiful. And he said, I'm just going to make some alterations here and there to make it friendly to us Baptists, and then we'll have our version of it. And that's the Orthodox Catechism. And we quote that sometimes on special occasions. We'll do a question from it. All right, so that's what he does in 1680, and that's an influential work. And then they're still meeting at Old Gravel Road, you know. And in 1684, Hercules Collins is in prison, and he writes a letter to his congregation, which is still extant, and in this letter he refers to them as the church that used to meet at Old Gravel Lane. And so we know now for the first time, that's our best evidence. It was right around that time they had moved to a location they would be at for a few hundred years, which was Commercial Street in London, still in Wapping, but Commercial Street. And so they met at Commercial Street for a long, long time. It's important to note as we talk about being in prison and suffering as they did, that B.R. White, who's a Baptist historian, called this era, this is 1660 to 1688, the era of great persecution. The era of great persecution. So for Protestant independence, this was the era in which they suffered the most. And this is, of course, the era in which Collins is the pastor, right, during about half of this era. And he was regularly arrested. This was a very common thing for him, just like with Bunyan. Sometimes you'd go to jail for 2 weeks, sometimes for a month, sometimes for 6 months, sometimes for a year or more. And so this often happened to them. He was a prisoner at the famous Newgate prison in London, which was a notorious prison. You didn't want to go there. And then, ironically, he got released from Newgate because it was getting overcrowded. And literally, they couldn't control the prisoners. It's overcrowded. So they built a new prison, which they very inventively called New Prison. And then once they had it built, they went back and rearrested and put him in new prison. So he's one of the few prisoners in that era that got to be in both prisons. And so anyway, to understand this period of time, what it would have meant for Hercules Collins and for the Baptists who were in his church, this isn't like what was going on in Bedford. Bedford, and I'm not in any way, you know the esteem we have for John Bunyan. We're not like he had it so easy. No, nobody's arguing that. The man spent years and years in prison. But his situation was just different. And so Hercules Collins was in worse prisons than Bunyan was, under worse conditions than Bunyan was. His arrests were more violent than Bunyan's were. Again, you know, this is not in any way to put down the courage of Bunyan or any of those other men, Baptist men, who stood and suffered for their faith. But in London, they were so tired of arresting and rearresting these men that they basically told the mayor, you need to crack down on this. And so we talked last week about how the mayor had threatened the Petty France Church, if we find out where you're meeting and this continues, we're going to tear the building down. And so they dealt with all kinds of things like this, of the police coming in and carrying out their seats, their pews, and starting a bonfire in the streets with them, or taking their whatever documents, whatever paper they had, taking them out and throwing them in a fire, of beating the congregants, women and children, beating them as they would come in and arrest them. And certainly Hercules Collins was beaten many, many times. But they preferred the police handling to what they were dealing with at that time, which was called the Hilton Group, which was a vigilante gang that was a Paedo-Baptist vigilante gang. You almost can't make this up. And you can look this up if you think I am making this up, but it's true. And that they would go around, and they didn't want Paedo-Baptist, they didn't want Credo Baptists in their neighborhoods. And so they were like, well, if the police can't get rid of them, we will. And they were far less restrained than the police were. And so they didn't mind killing people or beating people nearly to death. And it was a very violent time. A very violent time. So as bad as it was to fall against the government authorities, this Hilton gang was far worse. You didn't want to deal with them. And oftentimes they would burn your buildings down. You know, the government threatened to do that. I don't know. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I just don't know of any reported cases. I've not read of any cases where the government, the mayor of London, the Lord Mayor said, burn it down. Threatened to, I don't know that he did, but this Hilton gang did go and burn churches down. And anyway, so it was a very dangerous time. And sometimes I'm sure it would seem like getting arrested might have been safer than at times being in that kind of environment. But through all of that, and this is what Pigot's talking about his faith and his walk, he never said, let's move the church. He never said, let's stop meeting. And if, from what I'm understanding, if trouble came, Hercules Collins was one of the first to get in the way, like get between the danger and the women and children. He would be the first one to go out and meet it because, again, he knew what he was signing up for in preaching this. That's why I said last Wednesday night, and I want us to think about, under those conditions, would we meet? Or we'd say, oh, it's just too dangerous. The Lord will understand. It's too dangerous. These men believed what they said they believed. They put their lives on the line for it. And so it's just important for us to think through that. In 1682, if the fires were not already hot enough for Hercules Collins, because he keeps getting arrested for not obeying the law of needs to go to a state church, he writes a work called Some Reasons for Separation on why we should separate from the Church of England. And he gets arrested, no surprise for that. And he's put in prison. And while in prison, he writes another work and has it smuggled out of prison and to his publisher, George Larkin. And it's called Shall I, No. That's the name of the work. And so now he, while already in jail, gets more charges added on and more time added on. And now his publisher, George Larkin, is arrested and thrown into prison with him. And so this is the kind of age this was. So you can imagine then just a few years later when William of Orange comes into England and the Glorious Revolution happens and James II is basically bounced out of England and suddenly there is religious toleration for Baptists and for everybody, right? All peoples, there's religious toleration. Why suddenly it was a new day. And men like Hercules Collins got to experience what it's like for us, right? I mean, it would be, to think that we'd have to worry about being arrested coming to church here tonight would be an anomaly. It'd be something strange, like, well, how do you explain that? What happened? But for them, it was the first time ever gathering for church that they didn't have to already, count in the cost. We might get arrested. We might get beaten. And so they got to worship as we get to. We don't even think about it. I don't think very often about how easy it is for us to gather and worship. And so again, in 1688, the situation gets very, very much easier for them. And then in 1689, a year later, when now they say, hey, we can gather and get together and discuss this at the Broken Wharf Church and ratify this, he's one of the key figures there as the leader now, the pastor now, of the oldest of the assemblies, the oldest one of them, the most respected in terms of that, in terms of being a long-established church. He comes representing that church and signs this document as the pastor of the Wapping Church. He spent the final 13 years of his life focused on three things. And I think these are good things to focus on. I mean, I'm assuming we can already say his personal walk with the Lord and his devotional life and those sorts of things. But I mean, in terms of his public ministry, he focused on three things: pastoring and preaching. So that's putting that as one. Being the pastor of the church at Wapping, which he did pretty much until the day he died. He pastored that church. Had some other people there as well, but he was kind of the one everyone knew. He did a lot of writing. I did this 2 weeks in a row, had a book sitting on the table, going to walk out, grab that book, and I walked right past it and left it there. It had basically all 14 of the works that he had published. And anyway, it was an amazing list of works that he worked on. So pastoring, preaching, writing, and the final thing was training up future leaders. As much as Spilsbury was committed to that, Hercules Collins is remarkably noted for saying that if he were to not train up future leaders, he understands that's the Lord's business, but as much as he is able to be involved in that, he wanted to be. And so that brings us to what I want to mention here. By the way, he died in October of 1702, and he's buried at Bunhill Fields, which was the cemetery for nonconformists. So Bunyan's prominently buried there. Many of the Puritans are buried there because in that day they wouldn't allow you to be buried inside the city limits of London proper because you weren't an Anglican member. And to be an Anglican member meant to be a member of Britain and London in good standing. And if you weren't a member of Britain in good standing, then you couldn't be buried in a graveyard inside the city limits. Ironically, of course, the city of London grew over the years, and so Bunhill Fields is in the city of London now. But anyway, it's kind of their ultimate revenge, I guess. But anyway, but before he died, he really was interested in training up preachers. So the Orthodox Catechism we have in our library. If you ever want to check that out and just look through it, it's a really interesting book. We also put out this often. It's on the table tonight. It's out there on Sunday. How Should We Sing? It's a surviving work by Hercules Collins on why the gathered people of the Lord should sing and how they should sing. I mean, that'll take you a couple minutes to read it. But it just shows you what they were thinking about. And there was a singing controversy, which we talked about in that era. And so here was Hercules Collins' contribution. As I said, you can get the Orthodox Catechism in the library. And then we set this on the table often. The Temple Repaired, Restoring Preachers and Preaching to Christ's Churches. And this is sort of his final work. About a year before he died, he wanted to write a work on the importance of training up men for preaching, the importance of training up future leaders. And, his idea, I think, again, I'm having to read between the lines. This is something you can go out and just prove, but I think it might have been of note to him that Spilsbury was a pastor training pastors, and yet when he died, there was nobody to step in, right? They had to go out and find somebody. And then when Northcote died, they had to go out and find somebody. So it's like the church that was supposed to be about training pastors didn't even train up its own future leaders, it would seem. And so I think that might have had a big impact. When you read Collins, the way he's thinking is, those men were right. Spilsbury was right. We need to train up our pastors. We need to be willing to send those men out, but we also need to make sure we have qualified men in our own congregation to lead in the preaching and teaching ministries. And that's what this whole thing is about. And I would encourage you to read it. There is a lot said here about prophecy, and he just simply means by prophecy the forth speaking of the word of God. And that we need to train up prophets. That's what he means, men who speak the words of God. Not their own words, but just reading God's word and proclaiming it. That is what he means by that. And he'll speak a lot about Baptist terminology. We've talked about gifted brethren and things like that, which are men who we would say have a gift for preaching, but not for eldership. So you see sometimes men that are called to be preachers, but they don't meet whatever the requirements are for eldership. And oftentimes in Baptist churches, maybe that you all grew up in, or I don't know, you had a licensing process and an ordination process. And not everybody who was licensed got ordained. It wasn't just like a multi-step process. Sometimes men that were licensed were ordained. Sometimes men were licensed and they were never ordained. And that's kind of an old recognition of that idea that not everybody who is a preacher is an elder. And what we mean by that is simply that God gives gifts to many people to be teachers and preachers. And there are some people that he calls with all the gifting that's required in the scriptural designations given to us of what an elder must be. And that's okay. And that's not our point tonight, but it's just to say that there's some language like that in here. So you'll get a little familiar with stuff going on in early Baptist writings. But again, he was warning the church, I think even in his day, there's a danger to what our churches then, 1670, 1680, 1690s were doing, which was over-professionalizing ministry. Okay, now, what I mean by that is it's good to have trained ministers. It's good to have professional ministers. We're not arguing against that. But what he means is, rather than churches training up its leaders, it just goes out and hires them like a business would. Hey, we need a marketing guy. Well, let's go on LinkedIn and find a marketing guy, or whatever it is, right? Whatever it may be, you just go out and hire it. Well, churches do that too. It's like, well, our pastor left. Okay, well, we got to go hire a new pastor. And what he was saying is, isn't it better if you've trained up elders in your church that are a part of your church, they know your church, they are your church in a sense, right? They're just as much a part of the congregation as the congregation members are, which is a distinctive of Baptist doctrine, right? For instance, I was just asked this about a week ago, why I don't wear a robe? Some Baptists do wear robes, right? Why has there been a tradition within Baptists not to wear robes? And the reason is because there's a dual thing that we're trying to balance here, right? Which is, on the one hand, when I'm up here as the preacher, I'm speaking the words of the Lord. There is some sense in which it needs to be a serious thing, but you don't want to do that in such a way that it divides the minister from the congregation, to where it's like, because think of it this way, I'm just a member of this congregation also, right? In a business meeting, I don't believe I get 2 votes or something like that. I have 1 vote, just like you all do, because ultimately I'm a member of this church the same as you are. I've just given a different responsibility or whatever. Some of you have different responsibilities in this church. And so the point that we're trying to get at is, he's just trying to get us to think through the importance of training up people within our own churches, that our needs are met. Because if we take what the Lord says seriously, he provides that to us, right? He provides us all the parts of the body, and that we should only be looking outside if we need to. So anyway, that's not, again, the purpose either, but it's just for tonight. But it's just that's one of the things he was thinking about, and I think we ought to think about, because maybe one of the problems we've had in the 20th century we saw was that we really did get to the professionalized idea of ministry, that it's just like any other job when we go out and hire people. And then we bring people in, and sometimes they're not a good fit after all, or whatever, right? And it's a disaster. And then, we'll go out and get somebody else. And that's okay. I'm not saying that you never do that, but I am saying he would have us think about, maybe one of our responsibilities is to train up people within our church to be able to fill pulpits and teach classes and be elders and be deacons and all those various things that we need. We don't just think all of a sudden we need some deacons or whatever, or we need some elders. Where are they going to come from? We need to be thinking ahead of time and saying, let's look for people and let's develop them and all of that. So our Baptists were thinking about that, 350 years ago. So, we need to be thinking about it as well, I think. But anyway, that's kind of Hercules Collins in a nutshell. Like I said, you can go out there and get, I have, I think, 3 books that deal with Hercules Collins, and they all pretty much say the same thing. It's limited what we know, so everybody's saying pretty much the same thing. But an amazing person, an amazing figure in our own Baptist history. And so I hope as you think about it, you'll think particularly tonight about the willingness to follow and to pastor this church and be an early Baptist leader with all that it cost him. And it was a great deal. If you read the amount of time that man spent in prison, in pools of his own blood, etc., was significant. And I'm sure it's not easy to do that. And so, again, we've got some people that we can look back and say they were as close as I think we can get to being heroes of the faith, men who stood in tough times. So anyway, with that, I want to open the floor for any questions quickly, and then and just think for a second. I'll say this. Next Wednesday night, we'll have our fellowship meal. On Wednesday night, we've moved it because of an event Sunday night here at the church. That won't be the normal time. It'll go back to Sunday nights. And then there may be something, a class on Wednesday nights this summer we're going to see, but for sure in the fall, we'll be back to our normal class time again.